In this part of the assignment, we're going to explore the process and look at ways that we can create borders in Adobe Illustrator. This is a really useful tool in design, something you might use in different applications. The way we're using it here would apply most to logo design, but these ideas could also be used for page layout or creating borders or divider lines on a website. There is a template for this project. I do have it open here. It's a very simple one. It's really a structure for you to keep things organized. There's 6 boxes on one artboard, and each of your compositions will go into these boxes. So you're required to make 6 of these in total. All of them should have a different border, and you really want to explore what you can do with a border, so create variety, but also look at how can you emphasize or de-emphasize the border, which I'll talk about in a second. So first step is I want to save the file. And the next step is to create that centerpiece of these borders. So what we need to do is that all 6 of these will have the same icon, letter form, or glyph in the center of the border. So they all need to share that. So you could use an icon or a logo or something that you've made on your own, potentially another class or potentially in your free time. You could also use a letter form. So I can create a text box here, and I could just type in a letter form, and you could use any typeface that you like. So that's absolutely something that you could do. I'm going to scale this up a little bit. So that's one way to approach it. You could also look at the Glyphs palette. All typefaces actually have glyphs or characters that you can't see on your keyboard. They're things that exist in the font that are hidden. And by going up to type and glyphs, I get this entire box where I can see all of the other things that exist within a typeface. So some of those are accented characters, special characters. So you can just double click on these when you're hovered over a text box, and it will go ahead and enter them into the text box. You can even come down here and change the font, and you'll notice that different fonts have different things inside of them. Here's one that has really interesting arrows. So it just depends. That can be a fun thing to explore if you want to look deeper into these typefaces to find something that you're really excited about using for the center of these borders. Another thing that you can do is use an icon. If you're seeking something more pictorial, more icon-based, there's a great resource I wanted to promote during this project that could be useful. It's called the Noun Project. And this is a project that was created where people build icons and they share them on this website, and most of them are free. They're really all free, but the idea here is that if you use it for a commercial or professional use, you need to attribute the person who created the icon or pay for the icon. But since this is for school and it's not something that's being used for commercial use or is ever really going to go outside of our classroom, you're welcome to use these things for free. And it's a great resource. Sometimes I even use it as a research resource to look into ways that I can draw things. Sometimes it's interesting to type something in here and see a bunch of different ways to draw a leaf in this case. So when I'm looking for ideas, sometimes this really helps. And you can come in here and just scroll through and find one that you like. You could search other search words as well. I think I'm going to go with something like this. So once I click on that icon, I can click Get This Icon. And then you'll notice the payment part comes up. So if you were using this for a real project that was with a client or for a studio, you would want to pay for this. So you could pay for a single download, or you can get an account which allows you to download an unlimited number of times. I'm just going to do basic download in this case. Click Continue. And then I want to download the SVG. That's really important. This is a file that will correspond with Illustrator and will allow me to open in Illustrator. So I'm going to click that. That file will go ahead and download, and I'll open that up in Adobe Illustrator. So when you zoom in, you'll see that icon, and sometimes it's all in one piece like this one, but sometimes it's not. So one strategy I like to tell people is if you use the direct selection tool, you can drag over the entire icon to select everything at once, and that'll allow you to copy and paste it out of the file. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out. I'll do Edit, Copy, go back to our template and paste it in here. Then I'm also going to group it just to be safe. If yours is in multiple pieces, you don't want to move around those multiple pieces. So just to be safe, I'm going to do a Command G and group this. And now I have that icon, and it's scalable to any size since it's SVG, which is a vector-based format. So that'll be a good one that we could use as well. So those are some different strategies of how to get the center of this for this assignment. And again, you can use any of these strategies you want. We just want one thing. So don't do your initials. Don't do more than one letter. Don't do more than one icon. If you use some kind of a ligature or something where they're connected, that's okay. But we want just one glyph, letter form, or icon in the center that you will use for all 6 of these compositions. I'm going to go ahead and just use the letter form here, this R. If you do use typography, one important step is you're going to want to outline the type. Outlining the typography makes it vector, it makes it no longer editable. And that's really important here because it'll help us with the scaling of this as we're working on this project. So you'll notice if I come in here, I can actually type. I can add more letter forms. But if I come up and I outline this, which is in type, create outlines, a good shortcut to know as well, Shift Command O. Now it's no longer typable. I can't add letter forms, I can't change the R, but what I can do is I can really easily scale this. So if I hold Shift, it will scale it proportionately. Another thing that's interesting is I can actually edit the letter form. I have the ability now to actually edit the vector points on this letter. Don't do that, but it's an interesting thing that you should also know about outlining typography. So now that I have this letter form, let's look at ways that I can create borders. There's a couple different strategies and we want you to explore a few of these. We don't want you to do them all the same way. We want you to try out these different techniques. And again, we want in some of them for you to emphasize the border, so allow the border to take over the letter form. And in some of these, allow the border to be more subdued, to allow the glyph or the icon of the letter form in the center to take over. So I'm going to start with the shape tools. These are tools that we know from other assignments. I'll work with the rounded rectangle, and I'm just going to create a really simple rectangle around this R. So when I draw this, it comes in solid. So I'm going to do a little flip on the color so I have a stroke on the outside, and I can play with making this thicker. And so here I'm starting to create a really simple border. I want this to be perfectly centered, so I'm selecting both, and I'm going to use the align tools here. So this is an interesting thing to know about. This is a little menu for align, which changes what you're aligning to. And in this case, I want to align to the selection. So I want to make sure that's selected. Then I'm just going to press the horizontal align center and the vertical align center to get that right in the middle. And sometimes it's not optically correct. You'll notice that. So I'm just going to tweak it a little bit so that it looks more right to my eye. Another thing you can do is on any of these shapes, you have these little nodes in the corners. And that can allow us to actually change the radius of the rounding. So I might change that a little bit and round that corner a little bit more. There's other things that you can do with simple strokes as well. So we talked about that you can make it larger or smaller. There's also this variable width profile where you can change the width of the border. It'll change the way it appears as it goes around the shape. So there's some different options there that could be interesting to play with. They're going to do different things depending on what that variable looks like. So that could be interesting to you potentially. I'm going to undo that. Another thing you can do is open the stroke menu. It lives over here. And you want to make sure that you have show options on. I already did that. So click that show options and you'll see more options here. And here you can obviously change the stroke width, which we looked at already. One interesting thing is you can create dashed lines. So you can create dashed lines if that's something you want to do. And by changing these values, it will change the way the dashed line looks. So the first one is going to be for how large the dashes are. So maybe I want larger dashes, but maybe I want to have really tiny gaps so I can control the gap, how much or little space is between those dashes. You can even go with different size dashes. Maybe I want it to follow by a dash that's smaller than that one. So there's different ways that you can play with that, creating dashed lines, which can be really interesting. In here, it doesn't apply as much to what we're doing. You can change the way the caps are handled. So it's more obvious if I create a straight line. You'll notice that if I come in here, I can round out that end cap. So that's something that you can do as well. And then this could be useful. It's kind of interesting. If I turn off the dashed line, these are really about where the actual bounding box of the stroke lives. So it'll default to living in the middle. But if you select these other ones, it will change where that stroke lives, which can change how the stroke looks. So I can have it on the inside, the outside, or the middle. Sometimes that's helpful when you're lining things up. So there's some other options for you. Another thing that you can explore is layering multiple borders. This can be an interesting strategy. So I could take this rounded rectangular border that I have, and I can come up here to edit, copy, and then edit, paste in front. So now I have two of them. If I move it, you'll see that there's a second one here, just like the one underneath it. But now I'm going to actually make the stroke much thinner, and I'm going to change it to be white. So this could be a way to make the illusion of a double border. Maybe that's something that you want to do. You want to kind of have that double line happening. Another thing that's interesting is I could come in here, I believe, and I could change this to make it come more on the inside, right? Maybe I don't want it to be symmetrical. Maybe I want it to be more on the inside. You could also change it to be more on the outside, which would create sort of the opposite effect. So those can be interesting things to explore. One thing that you should note though, is if you're working with shapes that aren't rectangular or perfect circles, you can run into some problems. So let me look at that. Let's say I want to put an oval around this. I'm just going to put an oval here. It's defaulting to the last style that I used, so we still have a white line. I'm going to go ahead and make this black. You can do it here or through the swatches palette. All right. I want to make that a little bit thicker. There we go. And let's go ahead and center it. I just want to make sure it's perfectly centered. So we'll do this again. It's a little off on my eye, so I'm going to kind of move it. All right, that looks good. So one thing that's interesting is maybe what I want to do now is I want to create a double border like I did before. So I'm going to do a copy and a paste in front. So now I have two of those. I'm going to make this one white. Obviously everything disappeared, so I'm going to make this smaller, get it more where I want it. That looks pretty good. But let's say I want to make it smaller. I actually don't want it to be the same size, or maybe I want it to go actually all the way in and have another black line inside. Let's change that around. One thing you'll notice is that when I did that, there's more space on the right and the left than the top and the bottom. When you use the standard scale feature using shift and dragging those corners, it's not really intending to scale in the way that a lot of us think it will. It does work this way on perfect shapes because they're symmetrical. But on unsymmetrical shapes, it will not keep that stroke in the exact same place, which will not create an even amount of white around it. So there's an important tool that I want to show that will help with that, and that's the offset path tool. So let's try to do this, but do it a little bit differently. If I select this stroke and I come up to Object, Path, Offset Path, I get a little menu that pops up, and it allows me to decide how much of an offset I want. So let's make this, I don't know, 60. And you'll notice there it is. It created a bigger border around the border I had, and you'll notice that there's a perfectly even amount of white around the outside of it. But I wanted it to go inside, so I actually need to create a negative number here. So I'm going to try -10. Sometimes you have to kind of play with this to get it where you want it. That looks pretty good. I'll make the stroke thinner. So I'm going to click OK, and then I'll go ahead and bring this stroke down. And that would be a way to create more of what we were trying to create with that even amount of white around it using the offset path tool, which is better for this than the standard scale tool. And this is something you might run into with other things. If you ever have complex shapes that you want to have another shape that's perfectly inset inside of it, the offset path tool is really the way to do that. Another thing that's fun with the offset path tool is we could even play with creating a border that's actually built out of the letter form. So this is a little bit harder, but if I go ahead and go to the offset path, one thing that's interesting is you'll see that it will do an offset path for me. In this case, I definitely need it to be bigger. I'm going to click OK, and then I can go here and I can do the outline on that. So that's kind of a fun border. A couple more ideas with borders. One of them involves actually creating a rotation of an object around the actual letter form or glyph or icon. So here I'm going to click and select and delete these pieces. Whoops. These are connected. I need to ungroup them. Sometimes the offset path tool will group things together. So now I have just that R. So to start with this, I actually need to build a circle. And the circle is just going to be a template for me to follow. It's just going to be a way for me to make sure that I'm rotating and duplicating this object correctly. I'm going to turn it to an outline. The other thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need to know where the center of this circle is. So I'm going to turn on the rulers. If you go to View and go to Rulers, you can turn the rulers on. It's also Command R. And then that will allow you to click and drag a guideline into this file. So I'm going to pull two guidelines, one horizontal and one vertical, that go directly through this circle. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow me to find that center, which is really important for this. Then I'm going to go ahead and create a polygon. So it could be really any one you want. I don't know, maybe I'll create a four-sided shape and I'll rotate it into a diamond. All right, I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. I think I want a slightly heavier stroke so it's something that you can see, and I want to bring it over here and get it right at the top in the middle. So one thing that's important about this is getting it in the right spot, which can be a little bit tricky. So I want to show you another tool with the align function. If I select both of these, or let me put this off center more first. If I select both of these and I do the center align, they're both going to move and I lost my center. So another handy trick with the align function is you can come back to this little menu I was showing earlier and do align to key object. And one of them will get thicker. So in this case, this diamond did. But I want this one to be the key object that things align to. So I'm going to just click on that and it'll change with that one being thicker, which means now this will not move, only the diamond will move to align with that circle. So if you're ever in a scenario where you're trying to line one thing up to another, but you don't want one of the things to move, this is the way to do that. And you'll see that it changes this to a little key, which is saying align to key object. Now I'll click that center and it'll go exactly where I want it without moving that circle and destroying this center that I built. Now that I have that, I want it a little smaller, so I'm going to use the Option key, which will make it reduce in size from the center, which means I won't have to align it again. Bring this down, and that looks about right. So now we have the start of this. This is the object that I'm going to repeat around this entire circle to build this circular border. But now we need to use two things. We're going to use the rotation tool, and then we're going to use it in conjunction with the duplicate or the transform again tool to do this. So I'm going to select this. And then I'm going to go to the rotate tool, which is right here. It's also R. And then I'm going to come down and put my cursor right where these two guidelines cross. And I'm going to press Option, and I'm holding Option, and I'm going to click. And it'll bring up this menu. And this menu will allow me to determine the rotation of this. So a circle is 360 degrees. So you could just put in a degree value here if you wanted to, and you would see that it would move. I have preview selected so you could watch that. But what I really like to do with this is actually enter an equation. So I'm going to enter 360, and then I'm going to use a slash, which will act as a division symbol here. And then I'm going to enter how many times I want it to repeat. So maybe I want it to repeat 45 times around this circle. And that'll give me a value. So it allows you to really make sure that it's going to repeat the correct number of times. Then I'm going to go ahead and click Copy. This is really important. You want to press Copy and not OK. Copy will duplicate it. So now I have that rotation and duplication happening in one fell swoop, and that will allow me to use the transform again function to actually do this over and over. So now if I don't do anything else, I just come and click on the direct selection tool. I go to Object, Transform, Transform Again, which is Command D. It'll repeat that entire motion. So now on my computer, I can press Command D over and over and over, and it will rotate this all the way around the circle. And I should be able to come all the way back around, and it will do it an exact number of times so that border is completely even. So that's really handy. Then you can come in here and delete the interior circle if you want to, or you can also use it. Sometimes it's cool to use it and have it be a part of the border. So that can be another thing that you can explore. Really up to you. Sometimes it's hard to get that circle, so I'll select and drag and then shift select one of the squares so I can delete that. I recommend grouping this then. Definitely come in and do a group on these so that you can move them together. And the nice thing is, since they're all the same shape and the weight, I can actually then change the weight of it right here, which is really nice. And that can be an interesting way to create a border. Maybe more of a border that would be more emphasized than the letter form. So that's an interesting technique to use. We were talking about some borders taking a backseat and not being emphasized, and sometimes the border being more emphasized. You could even go with multiple of these, right? We could create maybe multiple series of borders that could be kind of interesting. If I select this and I copy and I paste it, I could actually make another one which might even more emphasize this border, right? The border's getting more ornate, more crazy, which is really going to help make sure that that's emphasized. And again, that's part of this assignment, is really exploring sometimes the border being more emphasized and sometimes the letter form being more emphasized. So that's some interesting techniques to explore. And then as you build these things, you can really move them over into this document when you're happy with them and try to scale them all a similar size, and you'll end up with 6 compositions all using borders. There's one more technique I want to show though. This is kind of an interesting one. It's a more advanced feature inside of Illustrator, but it'll help you create borders similar to the one that I just made, but in a more automated fashion. So I'm going to go ahead and come in and make some ellipses. So I just want to make some solid circles. I'm going to make something a little bit more complicated that might have been a little harder to do with that other function. You don't get as much control with this, which is unfortunate, but it's interesting how the computer can do some of the work for you. So I'm going to create something like that. I'm going to use, instead this time, I'll use the distribute because I want these to be evenly spaced. So I'm going to come over here and do the vertical distribute center, and that'll make sure that it's perfectly centered. Then I'm going to select these two, and I'm going to do a copy and a paste and just rotate them around so I end up with something like this. So I think that looks pretty good. Let's explore this. I'm going to group these together. And then what I'm going to do is, now that I have all of these grouped, I'm going to come up to Object, Repeat, Radial. And it's actually going to create something for me where it's repeating that thing that I made around a circle. And then you get all these different functions. You can change the number of instances like I'm doing here. So maybe that's what you want. You can change the scale by scaling it up. Maybe I need to scale this R down and put it in the center. Maybe it's something like that, right? But what's nice is that you can always change this. You can also change here and it'll determine where it starts and stops. So maybe for some reason you only want it on half of the side. It's another interesting thing that you can explore. You can also play with this, which will change the scale. So that's another way to change scale in here, and it will move it equally. And again, you can always change the number of instances, which in this case might be useful to make it a little bit more open. But that's another really interesting technique that you can use inside of Illustrator. It's one of the repeat functions that will allow you to create borders as well that can get pretty ornate pretty quickly. You can also do it with really simple borders too, but it just depends what you're going for. Once you have all 6 of your borders over here equally sized in these squares, we're obviously ready to go ahead and export this file. You want them more or less to be the same size. So try to work on that. And then you can go up to File, Save As, and we're just going to go down here and save it as a PDF. We want to use all the artboards. There's only one in this case. We'll click Save, and that will give you a file that you can then upload for grading or to be reviewed in the learning management system. So hopefully that helps. Hopefully you have fun with this assignment. You can always write your instructor if you have further questions or need help. And best of luck to you on this project.